welcome. Happy to see you. I'm Adam Kahane, the host for this webinar. As you join, could you please put in the chat your name, the city you're in now, and one question you're asking yourself related to democracy. So your name, the city you're in, and one question you're asking yourself about democracy as a way to start to see who's here and what they're thinking about. So your name, the city you're in, and one question you're asking yourself about democracy. For those who are just joining, we'll start in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, I invite you to put in the chat your name, the city you're in, and one question you're asking yourself about democracy. Wow. Thrilling to see all of you and the places you're calling from and the questions you're asking. Fun. Okay, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, we have closed captioning. If you want to see a text of what people are saying, so you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And also, we have interpretation into Portuguese for those of you who feel like listening in Portuguese. And for that, you go to the globe icon. I think, Colleen, you have to enable the interpretation. So yes, it's enabled. So if you would like to listen in Portuguese, please click on the globe icon. And if you want to hear just Portuguese, then click mute original audio. Mille, could you just repeat what I said?
Sure. Então, para quem precisa da tradução simultânea para o português, tem um botão embaixo da sua tela, está escrito Interpretation, e pode escolher o português lá e se colocar no mudo, colocar o inglês no mudo para escutar o português.
Okay. Just to repeat that again, for those of you who are just joining, welcome. Please put your name, the city you're calling from, and a question you're asking yourself about democracy in the chat. If you'd like closed captioning, press the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you'd like to listen to this in Portuguese, please press the globe at the bottom and choose Portuguese. So I think we'll get started then. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Adam Kahane. I'm a director of Reos Partners based in Montreal, Canada, where spring is slowly arriving. Just so you know, we're making a recording of this webinar and we'll share it with you afterwards. I'll introduce my two colleagues in a minute, but just to give a bit of an introduction to this session, we have a sense that the world is in a decisive decade, and in Reos, we're focused on how is it possible to collaborate, to deal with the challenges of the decisive decade, and we've launched this new series of webinars to explore collaborating for impact, not only as we have been to do our work and eventually write about it, but also to share what we're doing and thinking about more quickly and interactively. For those of you who don't know, Reos is an international social enterprise that helps people move forward together on their most important and intractable challenges. We work on economic inclusion, education, energy and climate, health and equity, natural resources, land and food, and peace, governance, and democracy. And what we're noticing, so we work on democracy both directly as a subject in itself and indirectly as a requirement to make progress on other issues. And what we're noticing in our work is that increasing authoritarianism, polarization, and misinformation are threatening democracy. This is true not only in the United States, as our partner Melissa Spatz of the Piper Fund told me in an interview I did with her last week. It's also true in different ways in many other places we work. A few days ago, my Indian colleague Arun Myra said that for democracy to be resilient, it requires both good hardware, institutions and rules, and also good software, a culture that supports coexistence and collaboration. So in today's webinar, two of my Reos colleagues will be sharing their experience and thinking about the hardware and software of democracy. We'll hear first from Mille Bojer, who's the director of Reos, has led our offices in Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, and now Geneva. She's worked on many large-scale multi-stakeholder projects addressing challenges including education, civil society, health, justice, and sustainable development. Welcome, Mille.
Thank you, Adam. Greetings from Geneva, everyone. It's really good to be here and looking forward to sharing with you some ideas around democracy, which is a topic close to my heart. I'm going to be building my contribution to this webinar around sharing some ideas from one of the processes that we were involved in a few years ago.
Sorry, Mille, sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to introduce Andrew and do the Mentimeter, and then I'll come back to you for the presentation itself.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
The other presenter today is Andrew Akpan, a senior consultant with Reos Partners in Johannesburg, a Mandela Rhodes Scholar. He's currently leading a project to catalyze action towards COVID-19 vaccine equity. He's passionate about the progress of Africa and is determined to help champion systemic interventions around governance and policy. So welcome to you also, Andrew.
Thank you, Adam. Really nice to be here, and welcome everyone.
Okay, in a minute, I'll turn over to Mille and then Andrew, who will speak for 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a good amount of time for questions and answers and interaction. But before I do that, I just would like to hear a bit about your thinking about the current threats and opportunities related to democracy. And we're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. So Colleen is going to share in the chat a link. Could you please, yeah, oh, why is that not working? Gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, but are you seeing the, yeah, are you seeing it on your screen? Good. Okay, in one word, what do you see as the most important current threat to democracy? So I'm glad in spite of my bad instructions, you all understood it. In one word, what do you see as the most important current threat to democracy?
Will you share your screen, Adam?
Sorry, I thought I was. Yep. Is that showing there?
It would be better if it was bigger.
Yeah. Sorry, it's best I can do right now. Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to go to the second question now. In one word, what do you see as the most important current opportunity for democracy? So you have to go to the next question. The most important current opportunity for democracy.
I think if we turn off our video, it will look bigger.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for that input. So I'll now turn it over to my colleague Mille for her contribution.
Okay, this time for real. Sorry for
This time
jumping.
for real, yeah.
This time for real. Okay, so yeah, really good to be here, everyone. As I started saying earlier, I'm going to be building my contributions to this webinar around sharing some thoughts from a recent process that we did around democracy in Latin America. This particular process applied a method called transformative scenarios process that we work with in Reos Partners. It's one of our core approaches. In the transformative scenarios process, we bring together different stakeholders who share are part of a shared complex problematic situation to build narratives of the future together, and in the process to deepen their understanding, to build trust, new alliances, and identify areas for new initiatives and for change. I'm not going to be speaking about the methodology here. I'm really going to focus on the substance of the initiative, but there's lots of information on the methodology on our website. I really want to focus on the ideas around democracy. So I'm going to share my screen and share a few slides with you. The process that I'm drawing on here is a project that was called Alerta Democrática, which means democratic alert. The group that built the scenarios chose this name because they wanted to alert people to the threats and opportunities of democracy. And that's why we also asked those questions of you in the Mentimeter. The people who developed these scenarios were from 13 different countries around Latin America, from different sectors, different generations, different gender, ethnicity, and different professions and disciplines. And what they have in common was a wide range of knowledge, experience, and perspectives, and a shared commitment to building a positive democratic future for Latin America. Some of them are actually on the line today, so I hope I do this work justice. I was a facilitator of the process. They're the ones who really built the scenarios. And maybe just one thing to mention is that when I first got involved in this process, I was concerned that democracy was too abstract for this group to develop scenarios around and for us to really get to something concrete. And I realized that that was a blind spot for me when a colleague from Bolivia said to me, democracy is not abstract, it's something that we feel every day on our skin. And that really made me understand how much of a lived experience democracy is when it's not taken for granted, and that this was a blind spot for me. The point of departure of this process was that Latin America in 2015 was at a crossroads. I noticed that Melissa Spatz in the preparatory interview for this webinar also spoke about the crossroads. And so there was really this sense of multiple possible futures. And in this particular time, a sense of the dynamic period of economic growth coming to a halt, meaning that new challenges were on the horizon. A sense that even though democracy today predominates in Latin America, it's far from being irreversible and should not be taken for granted. It's still consolidating its roots. Thirdly, that the pressing challenges of Latin America were demanding instruments and leaders who could really offer answers to those challenges. And this idea that democratic institutions in Latin America are young and still malleable, and that there's a high degree of uncertainty as to how they will evolve. And I'll come back to this idea of malleability. I had never thought about the malleability of democracy before this process. The group developed 4 possible futures of democracy in Latin America. I think these four stories are relevant not only for Latin America in 2015, but really across time and space, maybe in slightly different versions, but very relevant to the challenges that we face today, which is why I bring them in. The 4 scenarios reflect different outcomes in terms of power structures, democratic institutions and political culture, citizen participation, economic development and social inclusion, and also regional integration. So I'm going to share these 4 stories with you very briefly. The first scenario is a scenario called democracy in transformation. In this scenario, there's a new generation that evolves, that deeply values democracy, individual liberty, pluralism, freedom of expression, rotation of power and public deliberation. So there's a sense of sort of new democratic values emerging. And another core aspect of this scenario is the need to represent the diverse society of Latin America. So it's a scenario that's very much of institutional changes, and that has diversity and inclusion very much at its core. And that it breaks with historic patterns of inequality, exclusion, violence, and authoritarianism. And so when Adam spoke earlier about the hardware and software of democracy, this is very much a scenario that looks at the hardware and how that hardware represents the diverse society. And it's a scenario that's about where what happens to power is that power is shared and redistributed. The second scenario is called democracy in tension. And in this scenario, democracy remains primarily associated with elections. So people understand democracy as voting, but in reality, it's being employed for private and occult interests. And so it's a scenario where the vote is to a large extent captive, which means that people are either explicitly or implicitly buying the votes. There may be advances in rights and emergence of new leaders, but without altering the patterns of concentration of power. So power is still is concentrated, regardless of what party is actually elected to govern. It's still a concentration of power and not a sharing of power. And this relates to disputes over power and really kind of conflicts and tensions and polarization. The third scenario is called democracy in mobilization. And in this scenario, citizens draw on alternative methods beyond the vote. So this scenario really explores alternative forms of participation, drawing on new models of activism and social organization. It's a scenario of decentralization of power, but also of questioning of power. So people are mobilizing, voicing, expressing themselves, but also to some extent organizing and solving their problems more locally and empowering themselves to solve their problems. And an important message of this scenario is that these new models of the new technologies and the new models of activism can also be used by non-democratic agendas. And I think we see a lot of that happening today. And it may increase polarization, frustration, and mutual distrust as well. And the fourth scenario is called democracy in agony. In this scenario, organized crime is compensating for the shortages of government services. Leaders lack the political will to address organized crime, and so democracies are hijacked. And when security is so much at stake, it justifies authoritarian and repressive solutions. Now, if we think of this focused as on organized crime and on drugs, if we think of it as a Latin American scenario, that might be the picture that this scenario is very particular to Latin America. But if we think of the hijacking of democracies a bit more broadly, and also this phenomenon of other groups meeting people's needs because the government is failing to do so. You can think about extremist groups or gangs that meet people's needs in other ways, and also the weaponization of information and foreign interference and so on, that there are many different ways that democracies can be hijacked. And the region in the scenario learns lessons at a very high cost. So I think an important message of these 4 scenarios, the group chose to include the word democracy in the titles of all 4 scenarios. And they could have had a dictatorship scenario in there. It wasn't completely unimaginable, but that's not what they wanted to do. They wanted to convey that democracy can be many different things, and that democracy is not the absence of dictatorship. It's not only about, there aren't only 2 realities, dictatorship or democracy. You may have the vote, and you'll still feel an absence of democracy, or be living in a democracy that's somehow not genuine or not resilient and not sustainable. The second key point is that democracy is vulnerable. It really shouldn't be taken for granted. And I think we've been hearing a lot of this recently, acknowledgement that democracy is fragile. I certainly grew up taking democracy for granted where I came from, and I'm realizing that that's really not the case. And it's not only the case for Latin America or for Africa. It's really also the case in Europe and the United States, and in older democracies, that it should not be taken for granted. One of the key threats to democracy now is really around misinformation, and how misinformation undermines social cohesion, and the misinformation and polarization fuel each other, and in so doing can really undermine electoral integrity and democracy, and that's some of what we've been seeing going on. And this is an area that we're getting increasingly involved in as Reos Partners. And the third point is this idea that democracy is malleable. And I find this very interesting, that the younger democracies may be more malleable in this, and malleable means that you can shape it. You can get actively involved and shape the democracy. Institutions can change. In older democracies, it may be more difficult to do. So to change the electoral college system, for example, in the United States, it's very difficult because it's been going for so many years. But still, institutions can be changed. And there are many new democratic experiments that are emerging, like citizen assemblies, citizen juries, direct democracy and e-democracy. And these different experiments and new approaches can be combined with existing institutions and contribute to that evolution. And this is also something we're looking at in Reos Partners now, because what we do is we really do processes that involve what we call key people. We do multi-stakeholder processes where leaders from different sectors or different societal groupings can come together in these co-creative processes. But how do you combine these processes that involve the sort of bring all the key interests and roles to the table with the processes that are really citizen driven, that involve many more people? So how do you involve key people and more people? And then how do you link that with the processes that involve the elected people? Because the elected people have authority and legitimacy that different interest groups and stakeholder groups or citizens don't have. So those 3 processes are all needed, and they can feed into each other. And this is also something that we're looking at the moment, on how our processes can complement and be combined in new ways with both the traditional institutions or the institutions, the legitimate elected institutions, and these new broader forms of participation. So I'll end it there and hand back to Adam, and I'm looking forward to discussion later.
Thank you very much, Mille. I'm really surprised and struck at the relevance of the Latin American democratic alert scenarios for our current situation, not only in Latin America, but in many other places as well. And in particular, the conclusion of the Democratic Alert team that there's more than one kind of democracy. And I think this is needs to be better understood. So thanks, Mille. And hello, Andrew. Please feel free as we go along now and as we go along to put your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. We've turned off the chat to avoid too many channels going at the same time, but please feel free to put your questions in the section below. So I'll turn it over to you, Andrew. Look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Adam. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you this evening. Let me begin with why this subject of building a resilient democracy is important to me. And as I begin, I'm wondering how many of you in this webinar know which country in the world is the poverty capital of the world. And my country, Nigeria, currently holds that title, if I put it that way, having beaten India some years ago. Despite its wealth and resources, 50% of the country's population, that's approximately about 87 million people, live in extreme poverty. Many of these people have very little or no trust in democracy, and they have good reasons not to trust it. For example, I was telling my father some days ago that I'll be speaking on this webinar, and he asked me, oh, what is the subject on? And I said, democracy. And he kindly told me that I was wasting my time talking about this. He said, oh, go and find something better to do with your time. For him, democracy is a sham. It only protects and serves the interests of the rich in society. And I've been reflecting on what he meant by that, and his particular history. My father used to work for an NGO that was treating and rehabilitating young women and girls who were suffering from vesico-vaginal fistula, VVF. And with the financial crisis of 2008, the funding that used to come from Europe, to support that project was withdrawn. And more than my father losing his job, my father felt betrayed, and disappointed in the government who refused to step in and help these young women. And so when he tells me that I'm wasting my time talking about democracy, what he's saying in essence is that democracy is a system that was never meant to work for the ordinary citizens. And I am sympathetic to that view. I now live in South Africa, and the situation of the lack of trust in democracy is not very different. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world because the richest 20%, control almost 70% of the resources. And as I do my work and travel from country to country, I see people, expressing these sentiments and dissatisfaction with democracy. I paint this picture because, I think, in my work around the world, I see two dynamics at play. And it's a question of trust at one hand, and the responsiveness of democracy at the other hand. And even in my father's situation, you will see that tension of, okay, trust and democratic responsiveness. So I will share a few slides with you as I talk through this. So my talk will focus on this interaction between trust and democratic responsiveness, and how they combine to produce various experiences of democracy. Mille mentioned that democracy is a lived experience, and in this experience, I think it produces, or in this interaction, I think we can have at least 4 experiences of democracy. I will also share with you how to activate trust, and enable collaboration to enable a responsive democracy. And when I talk about a responsive democracy, I talk about the extent to which governments is responsive to people's needs. Government forms policies, and listen to people's interests, and at the same time respects people's rights. So what I see, informing these four experiences of democracy is the interaction between the level of trust that people have of government and its institutions and the level of democratic responsiveness. And what is really interesting is that even in one country, people can have various experiences of democracy, and that experience can shift from moment to moment. So I call it experience because it's really subjective, and it really depends on maybe a whole lot of factors: your proximity to power, your level of privilege in the system, your economic status, your political affiliation, can inform what you experience of democracy. So I will quickly talk through these four quadrants. The first quadrant is that of adapting. People experience democracy and just exist by adapting to it. And here you hear people say things like, for me to stay safe and secure, I need to say what those in power want me to say. And what is really interesting here, as I was thinking about this, is that we have seen, or I've seen, countries that are not very democratic achieving this element of trust. So they can be trust without democratic responsiveness. Maybe the government has been able to achieve trust through maybe meeting the economic needs of the people or working the propaganda machine. But however, there is trust. The second quadrant, I call it the resisting quadrant. And here people feel like if I speak, I will not be heard, so I fight or I leave. And resistance can take many forms. It could be fighting, it could be protesting, it could be people revolting, or people just packing their bags and leaving. And again, I see a lot of this in my context. And the third quadrant is the polarizing quadrant. Here people feel like I hold the truth, and I need to force my truth on you. And what complicates these quadrants is that, there is high democratic responsiveness. People's rights are guaranteed. So people hijack democratic tools for undemocratic agendas. And the fourth quadrant is the belonging quadrant. Here people feel like, the experience of people here is that, no, I'm really heard. The government is working in my interest, rather than serving certain political interest groups. So, and as I said, in one country, even as an individual, you can experience this, you can have these various experiences given the moment in time and what is happening. So I have intentionally not named countries because of that very, very fact. But I want to take a quick poll now and ask you, what is your experience of democracy? What quadrant, or which of these quadrants most represents your current experience of democracy? And Mille will launch a quick poll here, and we see. And there might be a temptation to say, oh, maybe I'm experiencing more than one, but just pick the one that most represents your current reality. And let's see what we have. Okay, I think, Colleen, please, you can close the chat and show us the results. Close the poll. Wow, this is really interesting. I trust that you can see the results. 42% of the people here experience democracy as polarizing. 48 as belonging. That is very interesting. And 39 as resisting, and 19 as adapting. I don't know where most people are calling in from, but I think it speaks to what is happening in your country. and it's very illuminative that some people find it experiences as adapting, and some as resisting, and some as belonging. So Colin, please close this for us. But my informed guess is that most people in Africa, where I do most of my work, will think of being in this resisting quadrant as their maybe predominant experience. And there are three patterns really at play that inform this conjecture that I'm making. And I think those patterns are the sources of low trust and low democratic responsiveness. The first one is the West's continued undue influence on the continent through neocolonial institutions. A friend told me, the West is still having its knee on the neck of Africa, very troubling image. And he was talking about the continued exploitation of the resources here and of its people. And in the work I do, Adam introduced that I'm leading a project on helping a group think about making COVID-19 vaccines equitable. What I'm seeing is that many countries, African countries, are disproportionately disadvantaged in the vaccination program. And even when they buy the vaccine, they pay twice as much than their Western counterparts. And this threatens the faith in democracy. The second point, pattern I see is the increased level of corruption and lack of accountability from our governments. And here I think you can readily find examples, whether in your own context or around the world. And the third is the rising inequalities. I've painted a picture of Nigeria and a picture of South Africa, and I think you get that. So what I'm really seeing is a sort of a vicious cycle of low trust, in these institutions, producing low democratic responsiveness, and vice versa. The question I'm wrestling with, and probably I'm inviting you to think with me, is how do we increase trust and increase democratic responsiveness? How do we shift things in the system? And I think, my solution is captured in this slide. It's to introduce these two wheels of trust and collaboration. Can we build trust, and can we build collaboration? The sort of collaboration that will enable trust, and the sort of trust that will enable collaboration. Not for its own sake, as we saw in the adapting quadrant. There are situations where trust can exist, but people feel like, the democratic responsiveness is lacking. So we want to increase trust and collaboration as we work towards democratic responsiveness. And I say here, trust, when properly activated, can enable collaboration. And I think it goes the other way too. Collaboration can activate trust, that together work towards the democratic responsiveness. And I will end, this is my last slide, I will end with three important lessons that I've learned through my work on what to keep in mind as we aim to activate these wheels of trust and collaboration. The first lesson is to normalize dissent. It's really about allowing people to agree, allowing multiple truths to exist in the system, and knowing that democracy wouldn't be democracy if people were not allowed to disagree. And I think that a healthy resilience, should encourage disagreements, or to a healthy level, and the tension is always determining what healthy is, and if I'm to give a brief anecdote, of how I saw this in my work. I was in Nigeria to facilitate a beginning of a process on justice transformation, where a group of leaders in the justice sector came together to begin to think of innovations to make justice user-friendly for the people. And in the middle of the section, at the first engagement, one participant turned to another who was a high-ranking police officer, and said to the officer, or said it openly to the room, I've never considered, the idea of being a friend, with a police officer. And pointing to the guy, said, I really like this guy, because I feel like we can disagree to agree. I might not agree with everything he has said in this meeting, but I like the way he's showing up. And I'm getting to that point because of how we have allowed space for this conversation to happen in the room. So it was quite a light bulb moment for him, and I think for the whole group. The second thing to keep in mind is that representation, when we bring people into our processes, we ensure that representation is both formal and substantive. And the formal representation is having the right people in the room. You know, people of color are represented, women are here, Black people are here, but that is not enough. It's not enough to stop there. We must ensure that there's a substantive representation where the interests of these people are defended and articulated. And the third point, you know, is that we have to take a decolonial approach. You know, maybe this takes many forms. One, the repudiation of the white saviorism. You know, there's a lot of agency on the continent, and we are really, you know, I think our processes and our work should try to empower people rather than, you know, stifle agency. The second point here is, you know, trying to center Black and indigenous methods and approaches to the work that we do. I'm thinking of a work I'm doing in Namibia and Mali on helping local communities adapt or build resilience to deal with the effects of climate change. And in that situation, we are really learning from the people. The people are leading, you know, and we are just following and helping, you know, to strengthen their methods and their approaches. So I feel like we need more of this or this way of working. And the third one is, you know, we need to rethink our funding model. You know, and here, you know, I think of my father's situation of losing his job because the funding stopped coming. But more than that, you know, I'm also involved in a project with an international NGO where we are helping them to, the title of the project is Dismantling Structural Racism within the organization. And one of the key recommendations that have come out is that, you know, the organization needs to rethink how they fund their program. You know, they cannot continually rely on Western countries to fund it. So, and I find that is very important, and it comes up in various conversations and processes that I'm part of. So in closing, you know, I think I've shared with you the 4 experiences of democracy, which is really subjective and can shift from moment to moment. You know, given our position in the system. I've shared, you know, that activating trust and collaboration is one way of making fragile democracies in Africa, particularly in Africa, more responsive. And, you know, I've ended with these 3 things that I think are things to keep in mind as we try to make democracy more responsive. You know, activating this wheel of trust and collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. I'm really struck how much in the current, in our current conjuncture, there's how much there is to learn, how much more obvious it is that we all have things to learn from what's going on in other parts of the world. And any earlier idea that by anybody, North Americans, Europeans, Asians, that we've got it all figured out, and we don't have to pay attention to experiences and lessons from others seems to be much weaker than it was before. So thank you, Andrew. Great. We now have the last 15 minutes to try to engage with with at least some of your questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There's already many questions, which I'm going to attempt to go through and ask my colleagues, Mille and Andrew, in turn to answer them. So Mille, if I can start with you, you've seen there's a number of questions about misinformation. Is it a symptom or a cause in a fragile democracy? The good and bad use of social media. So how do you see misinformation as connected to democracy, Mille?
Right. Well, I think first of all, on the cause and effect, it's both. I think when if the democracy is weak and there's I think two key factors. There's a low trust in institutions, but I think another key factor is the quality of public service media, which is also part of the democracy. Whether you have that sort of shared source of information that's trusted, that citizens generally can connect to. If the media is very fragmented, then that definitely also has an impact. So there are some things about a weak democracy that makes you more vulnerable to misinformation. But then misinformation, of course, as we've just seen recently, in turn also can undermine electoral integrity. And people, that's not only in the US, but also recently in Kenya, the elections were severely challenged because there was a lack of official information that was coming out. And so misinformation was filling the gap and led to election violence in Kenya as well. So you see misinformation about elections undermining electoral integrity and other aspects of democracy. But then there's, I think there's an important aspect here as well of understanding the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And disinformation is really this idea of like weaponization of information, that you're deliberately planting misinformation and targeting misinformation in order to cause confusion and cause polarization. And that's something we need to be really aware of, that yeah, it can be intentionally targeted, micro-targeted, and used in order to sow kind of polarization and undermine a democracy. And we need to just be very aware of and not naive about these dynamics.
Thank you, Mille. Andrew, there's a lot of questions, a lot of appreciation for and questions about your diagram, and in particular, how do we get this wheel of trust and collaboration moving? So from your experience, what can be done, including by those of us on this call, to increase trust and collaboration, if those are so critical to increasing democratic responsiveness and resilience?
Thanks, Adam, for that question. I think the challenges we are facing today, forces us to get to those wheels if we have to respond to them. If you're thinking of how to avoid the worst effects of climate change, or reducing inequality, or addressing misinformation, we know that no one actor can address those challenges alone. And in my experience, I think when people know that the situation is, is not sustainable in its current form, and even though they might not like each other, they feel like, at least we know that something is happening in the system and we want to work towards that. That brings people together. And I want to say there's also an element of hope that is required, hope that things can change, and the challenge is always to make people, to make people see the light at the end of the tunnel, that the situation can change, that democracy is malleable, that we can indeed, begin to create new realities. So to bring people into, from, a feeling of maybe despondency, to, okay, let's get into the process, let's work together, let's build trust. It takes time. It's, it takes time, and it takes courage to have those conversations, and for people to trust you. I think even as a convener first, you need to be trustworthy. You need to have the credibility to bring the system together. And in our work, we pay attention to that. Who is convening, and because in many cases, or in some cases in our work, people are so polarized. They might know that there's an issue, but they have their own way of solving it, and they feel like people should listen to them. So I think it's an element of, element of hope and element of urgency, that brings people to these fields of maybe let's collaborate, even though we might not like each other, but in that process they can begin to build trust. Like that example of the police officer, he came into the process, another person came in, and then in that process things shifted.
Thank you. Mille, there's a question about competing geopolitical narratives, especially between the US and China, and how this is playing out both in international institutions and in global dynamics. What would you say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think one thing to say about it is that it's certainly one of the reasons why democracy is also being questioned, and maybe rightly so in a way. I think that dynamic is in some ways bringing to light sort of a questioning of how effective democracy is, and there's a comparison that's going on there, and so I don't think that that's justified, but I do think it means I do think we need to pay attention to that and see that as one of the threats to democracy in a way that needs to keep us. That means we have to be even more on our toes and really make that effort and strengthening and creating genuine and resilient democracies, because it's not. We're not in a situation where democracy has just won and been achieved and everybody agrees that it's the best system. It has to be justified continually, and that's a part of that dynamic. So that's what I would say. It certainly keeps me on my toes around democracy to see what's going on there in that debate.
Thank you. I'm picking out the most difficult questions that I don't know the answers to. So the last one, Andrew, for you. You alluded to the need to let go of white saviorism. How can and what can we learn about non-Western centric and also indigenous methods?
Yeah, that is a difficult question, Adam. I think there have been, it's challenging to answer it, because in many cases there have been a systemic erasure of indigenous thoughts. So, the question, it begs the question: what is authentically, a black approach or a black method to solving problem? So there is that difficulty, but I despite that difficulty, I feel like particularly people like us that, are involved in this sort of work of helping enable systems and making systems work. We need to listen to the people that we serve. I don't want to start quoting texts and, resources, but I think it's as simple as that. Who do we serve and what matters to them? And are we allowing the people to lead rather than us coming that, oh, we know what is needed in this situation, so you have to listen to me. So let's listen to the people. Let's allow them to lead and let's follow.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mille. Thank to all of you who put these questions in the chat, many more than we were able to get to. We're going to continue the conversation on social media. You can use @Reos Partners, and you can use #collaborate for impact. Colleen is turning on the chat function again to enable us to have a last exchange in these last few minutes. So what I would invite you to do is to share in the chat one new thing that you're taking away from this last hour. A new idea, a new wondering, a new puzzlement, a new insight, one new thing you're taking away from this webinar. So Colleen, if you can put on the chat, and I invite all of you, one new thing, an idea, a wondering, a question, a concern that you're taking away from this chat. So great, thank you. Some of you asked about the recording, so we will be sending a recording to everybody who opted in to this this registration. We're going to be continuing to hold regular events on different subjects of collaborating for impact throughout this year. Please sign up for our newsletter where we'll have notices of it, and to visit our website, www.reospartners.com. So thank you again to Andrew, Mille, also Colleen Korniak, who's been in the background administering this super technically complicated webinar, and to all of you who joined us. Thank you for your interest and your rich comments in the chat and the Q&A, and we look forward to remaining in conversation with you over the weeks and decades ahead, as there's lots to be done together. Thank you very much, and goodbye.